Hi, everybody, and welcome to Dr. Archer's Lectures. When we were together the last time, we talked a lot about gross domestic product, GDP. We talked about how it's the total market value of all goods and services produced within a country within a given period of time. And we talked about how GDP could increase two ways. The first way being an increase in production, which is what we're supposed to be measuring, but it could also increase just based solely on an increase in the market prices. And in that discussion, we talked about using the GDP deflator to measure that, and we call that effect inflation. Today, we're going to look at inflation in a lot more detail, and we're going to focus today on consumer good inflation, consumer price inflation. And we're going to look at how that relates to and compares to the GDP deflator and the inflation that we saw in gross domestic product. So let's get right to it. Let's start from the very beginning with our definition. What is inflation? Well, inflation is an increase in the average level of prices, not a change in any specific price. So if the price of gas shoots up, as it often does, that's not inflation. If there's a snowstorm in Florida and therefore the price of orange juice jumps up, that's not inflation. Inflation happens when the prices of all goods and services across the board start rising, maybe slowly, maybe kind of abruptly. That's what makes for inflation. So what does inflation do to us? Well, it has several effects, the first of which is a redistributive effect. Some people are worse off, and that's not hard to see, right? If you buy things and the price of goods goes up, you're hurt by that. Everybody, pretty much. But there can be some positive outcomes as well. If you own a home and under inflation, the price of your home is going to go up along with everything else. So if the value of your home is rising, the value of that asset is part of your wealth. You're seeing a gain from that. That's a positive for you. So there's this redistributive effect. Some people gain, some people are worse off, and wealth is redistributed. There is, of course, the price effect. Rising prices require you to reallocate how you spend your money. If the price of gasoline went up to $10 a gallon today, we'd still buy because you got to get home from school today or home from work. But we would have to think about, where am I going to get that $10 a gallon? And it's going to have to come from somewhere. And there'd be some other area in our budget that we would have to cut to make way for that $10 an hour gasoline increase. When you expand that to include all prices across the board, you can see that inflation would force you to prioritize your spending, and maybe some things that you used to buy, you just can't buy anymore. And then, of course, that brings us right back to the income effect, nominal versus real. These are familiar terms because it's the same terms that we used when we were talking about GDP in the last lecture, and the definition is quite similar. Nominal income is just the amount that you see on your check, the face value of your paycheck. But real income is the purchasing power of that paycheck today compared to some previous base year. So can you buy as much today as you could in the base year? And that's the way you look at real income. So all of this is based on the Consumer Price Index. Inflation in the media is generally reported as increases in the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index measures the typical consumer's cost of living. They do that by looking at what consumers typically buy They come up with a market basket and they price that market basket and compare the price today with previous time periods. It's used to calculate the inflation rate, and we'll go into that in some detail. But when you hear the inflation rate reported in the media, it has to do with increases in the consumer price index. The inflation rate, by the way, is the annual percentage rate of increase of the average price level based on the consumer price index. And the inflation rate is the basis of cost of living raises. Maybe you have that where you work. And in many different kinds of contracts, they do have that. And if you received Social Security increases are based on cost of living adjustment. So let's look into more detail in how the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, is calculated. First and foremost, the basis of the CPI is a fixed market basket, a fixed shopping basket. The Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys consumers all across the nation to find out, how are you spending your money? How much are you spending on food? How much are you spending on housing? How much are you spending on medical care? On and on and on. And they put all of this information together and look at it, and they come up with a typical market basket. Now, this market basket doesn't represent any one consumer's actual spending. It represents all of our spending, typically. And this market basket is going to be fixed, because what they're going to do is they're going to compare the price of the market basket today compared to the price of market basket last year, the previous year, and so on and so forth. So the things in the market basket and the quantities of those things that we buy are going to remain fixed for a long period of time. So the second step is they find the prices for all the goods in the basket. Again, Bureau of Labor Statistics is doing a whole lot of surveying. And then they just compute the basket's cost. If the basket has 10 pizzas in it, and they found that the cost of a pizza is $10, $10 times 10 pizzas is $100. We have $100 worth of pizzas in the market basket. So now that we know how much this year's market basket is, how are we going to use that to compute the Consumer Price Index? The Consumer Price Index is a comparison of how much the price of the market basket has changed over time. So what we're going to do, we choose a base year. Everything is compared back to that base year. And then we compute the Consumer Price Index as the cost of the market basket in the current year divided by the cost of the basket in the base year, and then multiply by 100. This looks complicated, but we did something very similar to this when we were working on GDP in the last lecture, so this should be kind of familiar. This calculation will tell us what the Consumer Price Index is, but the Consumer Price Index is not the rate of inflation. How do you compute the rate of inflation from the Consumer Price Index? Well, inflation is the percentage change in the CPI from the previous period. So you take CPI this year minus CPI last year divided by CPI last year and times 100. Are your eyes glazing over? Let's try an example. I think this will be more obvious once we start working on it together. So here we are, and we have a market basket that's 4 pizzas and 10 lattes. Again, I want to emphasize that the basket is fixed. It doesn't change. It doesn't reflect any one person's spending. This is a typical person's spending, and it's just theoretical. And it remains fixed so that we can compare the cost of the basket one year to the cost of the basket in succeeding years. So here's what we're looking at. In 2010, the price of a pizza is $10, 4 pizzas, so that's $40. And the price of a latte is $2. We're buying 10 of them, so that's $20. 40 plus 20 equals 60. And in fact, that is the cost of our market basket. In the next year, we have 4 pizzas still. This always stays the same. 4 pizzas, but now we're paying $11 a piece. 10 lattes, but now we're paying $2.50 a piece. And that gives us a market basket value of $69. And then in 2012, same process. The things in the basket and the quantity stays the same. What changes is the price. So 4 pizzas, but now we're paying $12 each. 10 lattes, but now we're paying $3 each. And you get $78. These numbers out here are the cost of the basket. The cost of the basket then is used to compute the consumer price index. The cost of the basket this year divided by the cost of the basket last year times 100. So for 2010 is our base year. So the cost of the basket this year is 60, and the cost in the base year is 60. 60 over 60 is 1 times 100 gives us 100. But when we move to 2011, the base year remains the same, but the cost of the basket is different. So now we have the cost of the basket at 69, cost in the base year at 60. That gives us 1.15 times 100 gives us 115. One more time. In 2012, the cost of the basket in the current year is $78, divided by the cost of the basket in the base year, still 60. 78 divided by 60 is 1.3. Multiply that by 100, and you get 130. That's the consumer price index for that year. Still doesn't quite tell us inflation yet. Inflation, if you'll recall, is the percentage change in the consumer price index. So when we go to inflation, to find the percentage change, we take the 2007 CPI, 115, minus the 2010 CPI, 100, divide that by the 2010 CPI. So it's 115 minus 100 gives us 15 over 100 is 0.15 multiplied by 100, you get 15%. Make sense? Let's try another one. So for the next 2 years, for the inflation rate in 2012, we're going to compare 2012 to 2011. So it's 2012 CPI 130 minus 2011 115 divided by 2011 115 times 100. So it looks like this. You get 15% change here, 13% change here. These are actually your inflation rates. So what's actually in this CPI market basket? Well, we've talked about that the Bureau of Labor Statistics just asks a lot of people, how do you spend your money? But this is the way the basket ended up looking. The typical basket that's used to compute the consumer price index. So 41% of expenditures are for housing. 16.9% are for transportation. So house and car, that makes sense. And 15.3% is for food and beverage, groceries. Then from there it goes down. Medical care comes in at 7.1, recreation comes in at 6, education comes in at 3.2, communication comes in at 3.6, other goods and services comes in at 3.4, and this is apparel over here at 3.6. This is meant to reflect a typical consumer. Can you see how that might be tremendously different, for instance, for a retired consumer? A retired consumer, in many cases, would have his house paid off, so he wouldn't spend anywhere near 41% of his income on housing. However, as we age, our medical costs go up, so he'd probably spend a greater percentage on medical costs. And you can think about other kinds of demographic groups within our population and how their expenditures might compare to the CPI basket. This doesn't reflect any one person's basket. This is just meant to be a broad, typical consumer. It's a fixed basket, so year after year after year, the same items in the same quantity remain in the basket. It's done that way so that we can isolate the effect of price change. We don't have prices changing and quantities changing and items changing. Items and quantities stay constant so we can measure change in price. But that does introduce some bias, and one of the biggest biases that we see is substitution bias. Consider this. The CPI market basket says consumers buy 10 pounds of beef and 20 pounds of chicken. So in 2010 and 2011, consumers bought the CPI basket. So in 2010, the basket cost $120, and in 2011, the basket cost $150. But in 2012, households didn't buy 10 pounds of beef and 20 pounds of chicken. They bought 5 pounds of beef and 25 pounds of chicken. They changed what they bought, but the mechanism for computing the consumer price index really doesn't allow for that. It uses a fixed basket. So the CPI remains the same. We use 2012 prices, but the CPI quantities, so 10 pounds of beef at $9 and 20 pounds of chicken at $6, give us a cost of the market basket of $210. But the actual expenditures were 5 pounds of beef at $9 and 25 pounds of chicken at $6, for a market basket total of $195. So in fact, CPI measured a change in the cost of the market basket from $150 to $210. However, the actual change in consumer expenditures only went up from $150 to $195. So inflation was overstated in this case. Substitution bias is one of the problems with the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And that substitution bias comes into play because if the price of one good is increasing faster than it should, people will substitute. They'll move to the cheaper good. But that's not going to be reflected in the CPI because the CPI is based on a fixed market basket. So the CPI is going to measure that big jump in inflation for those increasing prices. It's always going to overstate inflation. How about the introduction of new goods? We had a market basket with 10 pounds of beef and 20 pounds of chicken, and lo and behold, somebody this year introduces sushi into the marketplace. Well, Consumers like sushi, they buy a lot of it, but none of it is reflected in the consumer price index because none of it has been included in the market basket. So the rate of inflation is distorted by the fact that people are actually buying these new goods and services. And then there's the whole idea of the unmeasured quality change. If there have been improvements in the quality of goods in the basket, that's not really inflation. That's just improved quality, so increased price. Not the same as just an increase in price. Consider this, when I was a young adult, cars commonly ran for about 100,000 miles. You couldn't really expect to get much more than 100,000 miles on them. During my adult life, the quality of cars has increased tremendously, and now I personally have run several cars to 200,000 miles. I bet many of you have too. So that unmeasured quality change shows up in the consumer price index as just inflation, just price increases, when in fact there's been a change in quality. So once again, when we talked about this in the previous lecture, we measured inflation based on the GDP deflator. Now we're looking at the consumer segment and we're measuring inflation based on the consumer price index. So how do those compare? First of all, imported goods are included in the consumer price index. The consumer price index just looks at goods and services that consumers buy without respect for where those goods and services might have come from. While the GDP deflator is based on GDP, and one of the requirements of GDP is that those goods and services have to have been produced within the country. Secondly, capital goods are not included in CPI. CPI stands for Consumer Price Index. The items that are in the market basket are all consumer goods, whereas GDP includes all finished goods and services. So it includes consumer goods, but it also includes capital goods. So those are included in the GDP deflator. And finally, the basket uses, the CPI uses a fixed market basket, and we've talked a lot about that throughout this lecture. The market basket is fixed so that we can isolate the price changes. The GDP deflator works the opposite. The price is fixed so that we can isolate changes in production. And so they measure things from two different points of view. Each has its value, each has its place, but they're going to give you a slightly different rate of inflation. So that's it for today's Dr. Archer's lecture. I look forward to seeing you next time when we will talk about unemployment. Talk to you again soon, and thanks for being here.